Hiya, welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be looking at one of the official residents in Washington, D.C., and that is the Blair House. And Chris, sometimes the Blair House is called the President's Guest House. I mean, this thing has housed loads and loads of international dignitaries. It's housed a president for a period of time. Even recently, it housed Vice President Kamala Harris for a brief period of time. So the Blair House is a place with a lot of fascinating history.
Yeah, and it's really one of those places that is, I guess, could be considered quiet, but has played a significant part in the story of America. And I guess what always happens is, something such as the White House is grand, it's big. Everybody knows the White House, and everybody comes to see the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and yet, Ray, if people would just stop and just kind of look around, they would see the Blair House, and they would see that there in that place, some very important milestones in American and also world history took place. And I'm just fascinated by this place, the Blair House, because there's not a moment in its history in which it did not play a significant part in Washington, D.C., but also in the politics of Washington, D.C., because this house has been there since 1824. And before it was called the Blair House, it was basically known as the house of Dr. Joseph Lovell, who was the first Surgeon General of the United States Army. And so you go way back to 1824, you have, the Surgeon General who is dictating all of the policies, procedures of how to take care of the soldiers in wars. That's the main place of office. And then after him, you have Francis Preston Blair, who comes into the mix. And here's this small town circuit court clerk from Kentucky, who the next thing you know will automatically redefine the presidency through the small rooms of the Blair House.
And it's a fascinating residence because, Chris, if you were to ride by it, if you were to ride by it, if you were just to see a photograph of it, it's not going, you're talking about, take time to look around. Because if you just ride by it, if you just see it, it's not going to jump off the sidewalk at you. It's not a building like the Supreme Court or the White House or the Capitol or any of these buildings. I guess it just looks like an urban building with several different structures sort of put together. And that's sort of the way it was actually. It was initially different buildings that have been unified into a single structure and put together. And you mentioned Francis Preston Blair and his son Montgomery Blair. They are going to be the ones to sort of bring this house into the official government sphere, though it would belong to their family for quite a number of years. So it starts out as different buildings: the Lee House, the Blair House, and several other houses, what they called houses. And over time, it's just going to be put into one. And I think by the mid 20th century, it's going to be a single house that is going to be used by different administrations from Andrew Jackson all the way up to the current day.
Yeah, and as we speak through the current day, and then kind of we'll go back to the history of it. You think about just recently, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to visit Washington, D.C., and giving a speech at Congress. And, you have all of these other foreign dignitaries who arrive to meet with the president. Well, right, they can't stay at the Days Inn or the Hampton Inn or the Sheraton. I mean, they need a place that has secure facilities. And the Blair House is one of those places. It's very, very close to the president. It is probably what is known as one of the the greatest Airbnbs you could ever think of, if you will, because it is specifically designed for foreign dignitaries as a temporary place to stay while they're in town. And what's interesting is, depending on who's in town, uh, the country's flag of origin of that person will
Yeah.
fly on the front stoop there. So, if you're riding by and you see the Blair House and it's got the flag of France, well, that just basically means that somebody very high up in the political world of France is there. And so, it has the greatest American hospitality. It's got 14 bedrooms, and each one has its own bathroom. It's got 3 formal dining rooms, conference rooms, there's kitchens, and they even have a beauty salon that is there, to take care of the guests who are in need of their hair being done or makeup being done. And Ray, you think goes back from the first person who was the Surgeon General of the Army, but then when the Blairs took over, Andrew Jackson is the president during this time, and it's just fascinating to me because I honestly, until I started hearing about the Blair House and studying about the Blair House, I never equated Andrew Jackson and his quote kitchen cabinet, that all of that took place at the Blair House, with one of the heads of the kitchen cabinet being this whole person of Mr. Blair. So it just was fascinating to me.
Yeah, Andrew Jackson, President Jackson's kitchen cabinet was a group of unofficial advisors that the president depended on more than he did his actual cabinet. And Chris, one interesting thing, sort of talking about presidential history and how presidents operate, is it's not actually that unusual today for presidents to sort of depend more on these unofficial advisors than their actual cabinets. Um, Going back though, I wanted to go back to 14 rooms, 4 dining rooms. That'd be great. I mean, you could stay in one room a night. You would have a different room for 2 weeks. Then you could have a different room for each meal of the day, and then you could get your hair done. I mean, it would just be a great place to live.
And there's an exercise room where you can work
Well,
off
we don't
everything.
we don't necessarily need that. I mean, we could turn that into a movie theater. Um,
Yeah, but it is interesting because we have, I mean, in the workplace, we have our teams, we have our organizations,
yep.
but there are times in which you need to seek out a trusted advisor who might not be in the situation, might not, and being able to go there and to talk to that individual is really great. And so that's where the kitchen cabinet took place with
Yep.
with Andrew Jackson. And it's time passes on, and the house is there, and
Mhm.
it really starts to take the appearance as it is today in 1942, when the United States government decides, hey, this is very close to the White House, it's a great place for our dignitaries to come and stay. And and Franklin Roosevelt, basically, he's in 1942 having to deal with a major crisis of World War II, and
Mhm.
he's having to usher in a lot of people such as Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill and all
Mhm.
of these people from overseas, and they need to have a place where they can stay, where they have quickly
Yeah.
easy access, if you will. And so they would basically come and spend the night. And Winston Churchill, now this basically became his house, his vacation house, if you will. Winston Churchill, I think, I'm not sure. Um, but I think he was the one who spent the most nights in the house. And of course, Ray, Winston Churchill, he's probably one of my favorite world leaders.
Right.
Teddy Roosevelt is American president, but Winston Churchill, I love him because he his personality, the way that he was, he had some very interesting happenings when he stayed at the Blair House. And one of those, he was overstaying there, and it was going on with World War II or whatever. And I remember that Franklin Roosevelt Jr. Recalled that his mom, so Franklin Roosevelt's wife, which was Edith, right? I think it was
Ella,
brain lapse. Eleanor
yeah,
Roosevelt. So she woke up, was having difficulty sleeping, and woke up, and there's Winston Churchill in nothing but a bathrobe with a
Hmm.
cigar in his hand and whiskey in the other hand, walking to get to Franklin Roosevelt so they could talk a little bit more about how they were going to handle things. And
Yeah,
that's when Eleanor said,
you gotta go.
"You got to go. Let my husband sleep. I can't keep. We can't do this. At least wait till breakfast if you don't mind."
I
Uh,
absolutely, I absolutely love that story because you have the official residence of the White House, and it's changed a lot since then since this particular event occurred in the 1940s. But I'm just trying to picture Winston Churchill, on basically really it depends on how you count it, but the second or third floor of the White House. He's walking through those hallowed halls in his nightgown and whiskey and cigar in one hand, and Eleanor Roosevelt bumps into him, like, Bo, you gotta go somewhere. We gotta find somewhere to put you.
which is leads the next morning, Franklin saying, "Guys, that house that's across the street that's for sale,
That's
or
where you
find
want.
out who's buying it, who's got it. We need to buy it because he got to get this man out of he's got to get out of the White House."
Now,
And
yeah,
what?
and one of the more serious events that happened in the White House actually happened following Franklin Roosevelt's death. Of course, Roosevelt will be elected to 4 terms, the only president in American history to be elected to more than 2 terms. He's going to die shortly after his fourth inauguration, and his vice president in his fourth term would be Harry Truman. So Truman becomes president. And Truman is staying at the Blair House because the White House is undergoing significant renovations. And so he's staying there, and there is literally an assassination attempt on the life of uh, Harry Truman. I almost said Harry Roosevelt. I don't know what that's about, but Harry Truman there. He's apparently asleep, and a Puerto Rican nationalist actually try to, I guess, shoot their way into the Blair House. And they are stopped by several guards, one of whom, um, Leslie, I'm trying to pronounce his name correctly, Leslie Koffelt. He's one of the ones who actually kills one of the would-be assassins. And the story goes that Truman slept through the whole thing, didn't even know that his life was in danger.
That's pretty good. I mean, that's some pretty good sound sleep. Um, and it just shows you the history of it. I'll go back to, the beginnings of the Civil War. And one of the things that I honestly didn't know until I started just reading up on the Blair House is that it was at the Blair House when Francis Blair, who was friends with President Lincoln, actually goes to Robert E. Lee
Yeah.
and says, "Meet me at my house." And so Robert E. Lee goes to the house, the Blair House, and it is there in which Blair says, "The President of the United States has offered you, Robert Lee, command of the Union Army if you want it. It's yours. You can have it." And Robert E. Lee, knowing that Virginia was about to leave the Union and go for the South, knowing that that was his first love and that he cared so much about Virginia, he declined the offer.
Yep.
He resigned his commission from the United States Army, if you will, and instead he would take over the Confederate Army. And I think that that's important because that was a historic moment in our history. And Ray, I honestly didn't know it took place in the Blair House until studying about the Blair House.
It's fascinating how many historical events, how many world leaders have stayed at that house. It's interesting on the Blair House website, which I would encourage our listeners to visit. It's www.blairhouse, BLAIR house.org. They have the Blair House guest book, and you can go on this guest book and look at I guess you would say, screenshots or images of the actual signatures and notes and things that have been left by various world leaders. I mean, you've got Queen Elizabeth II, you've got Angela Merkel, who was, of course, the Chancellor of Germany. You've got all sorts of people, the Prime Minister of Iraq from 2004. But you also have people who maybe, American leaders, president elects. That is, after a president has, or after someone's been elected president, but before they're inaugurated in January, they're called president elect. And this is where they often will stay when they're in DC, especially in the lead up to the inauguration. So you have a signature by Barack Obama. You have signatures from Nancy Reagan. You have all sorts of people in here. I'm just trying, Tony Blair, of Great Britain, all sorts of people in here. Benjamin Netanyahu, Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton. All these people have signed this guest book. The Bushes and others. Because they were staying there at the president's guest house. I guess if you're going to stay in the guest house, you sign the guest book. And some of these signatures and the notes that they left makes me feel a little better about my handwriting.
Well, I remember trying to read some of them and trying to decipher what they were saying, but I remember one of them, I couldn't read who it was, but he was just talking about the simplicity, the beauty, and the well. It was one of like the best experiences. I mean, they would have given it 10 stars. And he says, and that comes from my wife. And he put in that letter, and I always agree with my wife. And so, it's those little things. But you're right, because President Truman was living there because the White House was in shambles
Yeah.
and they needed renovation. I didn't know how bad it was, but they said it was so bad that the second floor of the White House was about to cave in, and
Yeah,
they had put some emergency supports in.
yeah,
But yeah,
they basically gutted it.
yeah, and because it was so and outdated. But you think about that. You're talking about Putin has been there.
Mhm.
So you've got the leader of Russia who has stayed in the same place that the leader of Afghanistan or Iraq or China, all of these different places. I mean, it just shows you the power that has been in those rooms and the talks that have taken place in that room.
Yeah.
And yet, what makes it so symbolic of America is it's quaint, it's quiet, it's just a simple house building on a road downtown Washington, D.C., that people pass every day and probably have no idea
Yeah.
of the history that has walked through those doors.
And you know what? It is such a wonderful place to be that not all of the important guests have signed the guest book.
Hmm.
I mean, it's got otherworldly guests
Right.
that have made their home there at the Blair house. And of course, our regular listeners will know this is Chris's favorite part of these episodes when we're talking about a historical location or building, and I go off on one of these. He knows I'm going to do it, so it's just sort of, he just sort of,
But to be honest, I'm waiting in great anticipation. It's kind of like walking in and waiting for a ghost to get me. So I'm sure that you have something supernatural maybe about this beautiful place.
yeah, I mean, it is. There is, and it's not surprising. I mean, if you think about it, we did an episode on the White House, and it certainly is haunted. It was Harry Truman who made the statement, this place is haunted, because he was staying there one night up in the residence by himself and just, was constantly aggravated by all the noises and going ons. So it's not surprising that the Blair House as well would have some otherworldly guests. Um, People have reported seeing a variety of figures, including children. Um, they'll see a child in a glass or window, and they'll turn around and the child will not be there. some people have actually, Chris, reported seeing Harry Truman. So Harry Truman himself apparently has left the White House and moved to the Blair House. Um, and actually, some of the original Blair family are said to stay in the house, metaphorically speaking. And that before you will, around 3 o'clock in the morning, you will start smelling some really bad smells. And I guess that's a sign that some of the family are about to appear.
It's just, I really thought we were doing a really good podcast. I mean, we were like really honed in, everything was going great. And I
And
mean, I knew there was going to be something spectacular that was going to happen. But you telling me that there's a foreign smell that starts to appear before there's the
well,
presence of ghosts,
actually, the people say a rancid smell.
a rancid smell.
Around 3 o'clock in the morning, there will be that rancid smell.
Well, for those listeners that are still listening to the podcast after that wonderful thing, it is interesting that you can understand the history that is behind it, and who knows? I mean, you have listened to this podcast long enough, you know that wherever there's history you didn't know but should, there's always a Ray ghost story that is
Uh,
somewhere close to it.
you got to have that. You really do.
You do. And so for that, I give you thanks for introducing us to.
And Chris will never stay at the Blair Mansion.
Not now, not now, but I am interested. And like I said, they have probably one of the best websites I've ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
they
very
do.
well done. You can take tours through the website, looking at some of the photos of the rooms. You can look at the different things, and it's just neat going in and seeing some of the stuff that before they leave to go be sworn in. There's Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan sharing an intimate kiss, but also seeing that you have President Obama and President Jinping Xi of China meeting at the Blair House for
Mhm.
some talks. So just a lot of history there, and I was really thankful to be able to be introduced to it. And by the way, it was the place that Harry Truman and his daughter, I think, stayed the night before John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
They signed a guest book.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, thank you very much. I hope our listeners will share this podcast. You share it with your family, your friends. We are all on Spotify. You can also find us on Facebook. Until next time, I'm Ray,
I'm Chris.
and we'll talk to you later.